Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The silence in the main house of the Shadow Hill Ranch was a living thing. It settled in the corners like dust, clung to the heavy velvet curtains Margaret had chosen, and filled the empty chair across the dinner table from Elijah. For 3 years, since the day the news of the stagecoach attack had arrived like a physical blow, silence had been his only constant companion. It was a cold, unforgiving partner, but a predictable one. Elijah had come to prefer it. His ranch, a sprawling kingdom of rolling hills and sharp-edged mountains under the vast Montana sky, was a testament to his discipline. Every fence was mended, every head of cattle accounted for, every ledger balanced to the penny. He controlled his land with an iron will because his life, his heart, had spun violently out of his control and shattered. The world had taken Margaret, and in her place it had left him this hollow empire of solitude. At 40, Elijah's face was a map of his life, carved by sun and wind, etched with a grief that had hardened into a permanent severity. His dark hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes, once alight with plans for the future, were now the flat, cold grey of a winter sky. The decision to hire more help had not been his. It had been a matter of necessity, pointed out by his stern, humorless housekeeper, Frances. She had been with his family for decades, a fixture of starched aprons and tight-lipped disapproval. "The house is too large, mister." "Elijah," she had declared, her voice as crisp as a dead leaf. "My bones aren't what they were. We need another pair of hands for the scrubbing and mending. A strong, quiet girl." Elijah had simply nodded, wanting the conversation to end. He didn't want another presence in the house, another set of footsteps to echo in the halls where Margaret's laughter used to ring. But Frances was right. The ranch needed to run, and the house was part of it. So he had sent word to the nearest town, a simple request for a hired girl. No questions asked as long as the work was done. That was how she arrived. Not in a carriage or even a buckboard, but on foot, walking up the long, dusty drive with a small child holding tightly to her hand. Elijah watched them from the window of his study. She was a native woman, Lakota, by the look of her beaded moccasins and the proud, straight line of her back. She wore a simple, durable dress of buckskin, worn but meticulously clean. Her long black hair was woven into a single, thick braid that fell past her waist. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed to belong to the land itself, not to the confines of a house. The boy, no older than 3, was a miniature version of her, with the same dark, serious eyes and a tangle of black hair that fell across his forehead. When they reached the porch, she did not knock immediately. Instead, she knelt, straightened the boy's simple tunic, and whispered something to him in a language Elijah did not understand. The sound was soft, like the rustle of leaves. It was an unwelcome note of tenderness in his silent house. He finally opened the heavy oak door himself, cutting short the sharp rap Frances was about to deliver. He stood on the threshold, a formidable figure, blocking the light. "You're the one answering the advertisement?" His voice was rough from disuse. The woman looked up, her gaze direct and unflinching. Her eyes were the deepest, saddest brown he had ever seen, yet they held no plea for pity, only a quiet, unyielding strength. "I am Winona," she said, her voice low and steady. "This is Ahote. He is my son. He will be no trouble. We seek work." Frances appeared at Elijah's shoulder, her lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval. "An Indian, and with a child. Elijah, this is hardly what I had in mind. Think of the disruption." Elijah ignored her, his eyes still fixed on Winona. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the fierce, protective way her hand rested on the boy's shoulder. He didn't want them here. He didn't want the complication, the child's noise, the woman's silent sorrow that seemed to mirror his own in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. But he needed the help, and turning them away to walk miles back to town felt wrong. It was a flicker of a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, and he immediately smothered it. This was a business transaction, nothing more. "The work is hard," he stated flatly. "Scrubbing floors, laundry, mending, helping in the kitchen. You'll answer to Frances. Your lodgings are a small room off the scullery. You'll take your meals in the kitchen. The pay is $10 a month plus room and board." A lesser person might have flinched at the coldness of his tone, but Winona merely gave a slow, deliberate nod. "That is acceptable." "The boy," Frances interjected, her eyes narrowing at Ahote. "He is not to be underfoot. He will stay out of the main rooms and make no noise." Winona's gaze shifted to Frances, and for a second, the quiet strength in her eyes sharpened into something as hard as flint. "He is a child, not a ghost. He will be quiet, but he will be where I can see him. I will not have him locked away." The challenge hung in the air, a silent battle of wills on the porch. Elijah found himself unexpectedly intrigued. This woman, who had arrived with nothing but a child, and the clothes on her back, was not afraid. He made a decision. "Those are the terms," he said, stepping aside. "Take them or leave them." Winona held his gaze for another long moment before giving another single nod. She guided her son past the formidable figures of Elijah and Francis into the cool, dim interior of the house. Ahote shied away, pressing his face into his mother's dress as he passed Elijah, his small hand clutching a fold of the buckskin. And so a new presence entered the silent house. But it was not the disruption Francis had feared. Winona was a phantom. She moved through the rooms with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. Floors were scrubbed, linens were washed and folded with meticulous care, and mending was done by the low light of the kitchen fire late at night, her stitches small and perfect. She spoke only when necessary, her answers to Francis's constant, barbed criticisms always brief and respectful, yet never subservient. She built a wall of silence and dignity around herself and her son, a fortress that no one could penetrate. Ahote was her shadow, a small, silent observer who played with carved wooden figures in whatever corner his mother was working. He rarely made a sound, his large dark eyes taking in everything with a solemn curiosity. Elijah found himself watching them. He would sit in his study, the door ajar, and listen to the soft swish of Winona's broom, or the faint murmur of her voice as she spoke to her son in their native tongue. He told himself he was merely ensuring his employee was doing her job. But it was more than that. He was drawn to the profound melancholy that clung to her like a second skin. It was a grief as deep as his own, but where his had turned to bitter, jagged stone, hers was a current of quiet sorrow that flowed beneath a surface of immense strength. One evening, he was walking past the kitchen and paused in the shadows of the hallway. The lamps were out, save for a single candle on the table where Winona was darning one of his shirts. Ahote was asleep on a small pallet of blankets in the corner. As she worked, a soft, haunting melody drifted from her lips. It was a lullaby, a simple, sad tune that seemed to carry all the weight of the world in its notes. The sound pierced through the armor around Elijah's heart. It was a melody he knew, a half-forgotten tune from a life that felt like it belonged to another man. A lullaby Margaret used to hum to herself as she arranged wildflowers in a vase, dreaming of the day she would sing it to their child. He recoiled as if struck, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. It was a coincidence. It had to be. A simple folk song, perhaps. He was a fool, letting grief play tricks on his mind. He retreated back to the silence of his study, pouring himself a whiskey with a shaking hand. He would not allow it. He would not allow this woman and her child to disturb the ghosts he had so carefully learned to live with. She was a servant, a pair of hands, nothing more. He would reinforce the walls around his heart, build them higher and stronger than ever before. He would not feel. He would not remember. He would simply endure, as he had for 3 long, silent years. The days at Shadow Hill Ranch settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. The initial tension of Winona and Ahote's arrival did not disappear, but it hardened into a kind of brittle routine. Winona remained an enigma, a silent figure of diligence who scrubbed, cooked, and cleaned with a focus that bordered on religious devotion. She erected an invisible wall around herself and her son, and while Elijah could see through it, he could not pass. He told himself he didn't want to. He had his work, his ledgers, his solitary rides across the vast expanse of his property. Yet his eyes were drawn to them more often than he cared to admit. He found himself pausing by the window, watching Ahote chase butterflies in the small patch of grass behind the kitchen, his silent world occasionally punctuated by a soft, childish laugh that felt alien and yet strangely welcome in the oppressive quiet of the house. Francis, however, saw Winona's quiet dignity as insolence. She would follow the Lakota woman through the house, her sharp eyes searching for any speck of dust missed, any task left undone. "The floors in the West Wing need another polishing," she would snap, or, "That mending is not up to the standards of this house." Winona would simply meet the older woman's glare with her calm, unreadable gaze, and reply, "Yes, ma'am," before turning to complete the task flawlessly. Her refusal to be baited or broken infuriated Francis, and to Elijah's secret shame, earned his grudging respect. The memory of the lullaby remained a splinter in his mind. He had tried to dismiss it, to bury it under the weight of his daily duties, but it haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. It was a melody woven into the fabric of his love for Margaret, a private tune for a future that had been stolen from them. Hearing it from the lips of a stranger felt like a desecration, a cruel trick of a grieving mind. Then came the second crack in his carefully constructed reality. It was a cool afternoon. Elijah was in his study, the doors open to the main hall, trying to reconcile an account book that refused to balance. His frustration was mounting. He heard the soft scrape of a brush on the wooden floor and knew Winona was polishing the hall. Ahote sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase, engrossed in a game with a handful of smooth grey stones he had collected from the creek bed. Elijah watched the boy from the corner of his eye. Ahote lined the stones up, moved them around, his small face a mask of concentration. Then he paused, and with his free hand he made a peculiar gesture. He rubbed his thumb twice against the side of his index finger. It was a quick, absent-minded motion, a small, nervous habit. The pen fell from Elijah's hand, clattering onto the polished surface of his desk. The sound made Ahote look up, his dark eyes wide. Elijah's blood ran cold. That gesture, it was not just a gesture, it was a signature. It was the same nervous tick his own father, a stern and formidable man, had possessed. Elijah had watched him do it 1,000 times while poring over ledgers, while contemplating a difficult decision, while staring out at the land that was now his. It was a small inherited piece of the man, a quirk so specific and so ingrained that Elijah himself sometimes caught his own hand doing it. To see it in this boy, this stranger's child, was impossible. His mind reeled, grasping for a logical explanation. It was a meaningless twitch, a coincidence. He was seeing ghosts. His grief was making him mad, conjuring connections where none existed. He slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing through the hall like a gunshot. Winona looked up, startled, her hand frozen over the floorboards. Ahote flinched, gathering his stones close. "Get back to work," Elijah growled, his voice harsher than he intended. He didn't look at them, couldn't bear to see the boy's face. He retreated into his study and slammed the doors, shutting out the sight, but he could not shut out the seed of suspicion that was now taking root in the barren soil of his heart. A week later, the fragile peace of the ranch was shattered. The afternoon sun beat down with a lazy, oppressive heat. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dry grass. Most of the ranch hands were out on the range, and a sleepy quiet had fallen over the homestead. Elijah was inspecting a new stallion in the main corral, a magnificent beast with a coat the color of burnished copper. His foreman stood beside him, discussing the horse's lineage. From the corner of his eye, Elijah saw Ahote slip out of the kitchen's back door. The boy had a fascination with the horses, and despite his mother's warnings, was often drawn to the corrals, watching the powerful animals from a safe distance. Today, he was bolder. He crept closer to the fence, his small hands gripping the rough wooden rails, his eyes wide with wonder as he watched the stallion. Elijah felt a prickle of unease, but was distracted by a question from his foreman. It happened in an instant. A ranch hand on the other side of the yard dropped a heavy iron bucket. The clang echoed across the dusty ground. The stallion, already high-strung, exploded in a panic of pure equine terror. It reared, its powerful hooves flailing in the air, its scream of fear tearing through the quiet afternoon. The horse wasn't aiming for the boy. It didn't even see him. But as it came down, its powerful body slammed against the fence where Ahote was standing. The impact sent a violent shudder through the rails. The boy was thrown backward, his head hitting the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud. He lay still for a terrifying second before letting out a thin, sharp cry of pain. Time seemed to stop. The foreman's voice faded away. All Elijah could hear was the child's cry and the pounding of his own heart in his ears. An instinct he thought had died with Margaret roared to life within him. He didn't think. He reacted. He vaulted over the fence, moving with a speed and purpose he hadn't felt in years. He reached the boy in a few long strides, his mind a maelstrom of fear. He knelt, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he checked the child for broken bones. Ahote was crying now, deep gulping sobs of fear and pain. "It's all right, son, you're all right," Elijah murmured, the word son slipping out before he could stop it. He saw a scrape on the boy's shoulder and a tear in his simple cotton tunic. He carefully peeled the fabric back to inspect the wound, to see if it was serious. And then he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. His entire world, which had been slowly cracking, now split wide open. There, on the smooth brown skin of the child's left shoulder, was a mark. It was not a bruise from the fall. It was a birthmark, pale against his skin, perfectly and unmistakably shaped like a tiny crescent moon. Elijah stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a ghost from his own reflection, a mirror of the past. It was the hereditary mark of his family, passed down through generations, a mark that he himself bore on his own left shoulder, a mark that Margaret had, a fainter version on her right. It was the mark they had joked about, prayed for, the one sign that would have confirmed their child as a true heir to the Shadow Hill Ranch. He felt a wave of vertigo, as if the solid ground beneath him had turned to water, the lullaby, the gesture, and now this irrefutable, impossible proof. Winona was running toward them, her face a mask of terror, her silent composure completely gone. "Ahote!" she cried, her voice raw with panic, but Elijah barely heard her. He looked up from the impossible mark on the child's shoulder to the woman's desperate face, the quiet servant, the grieving widow, the mysterious stranger. And in that moment, all the confusion, all the buried grief, all the terrifying hope coalesced into a single blazing emotion, a cold, hard rage. He was being deceived. He was being made a fool of. This was not a coincidence. This was a conspiracy, and he would tear the truth from her no matter the cost. Winona reached them in a flurry of buckskin and desperation, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She fell to her knees beside Ahote, her hands fluttering over him, checking for injuries, her face a portrait of pure maternal terror. "Ahote, my son, are you hurt? Speak to me," she pleaded in her native Lakota, her voice thick with unshed tears. The boy, still sobbing, reached for her, burying his face in her shoulder. But Elijah's presence was a storm cloud blocking out the sun. He rose slowly to his feet, his shadow falling over them. The protective tenderness he had felt only moments before had evaporated, replaced by an icy fury that chilled the very air. "Get up," he commanded. His voice was dangerously low, stripped of all emotion save for a cold, sharp edge. It was the voice he used for rustlers and wolves, not for women and children. Winona looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with confusion and fear. She saw the transformation in his face, the way his jaw was set like granite, the way his grey eyes had become chips of ice. She clutched Ahote tighter. "He is hurt. He needs—" "I said, get up," Elijah repeated, his voice cutting through her protest like a whip. "Leave the boy. You and I are going to talk now." The foreman and the few other hands who had witnessed the accident stood frozen, sensing the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. This was not the concern of a master for a servant's child. This was something else entirely, something raw and personal. Trembling, but with her innate dignity refusing to let her cower, Winona gently set Ahote on his feet. The boy immediately clung to her leg, his small face streaked with dirt and tears. She stood to face Elijah, a lone, slender pine weathering the blast of a blizzard. "What is this? He is just a child. It was an accident." Elijah let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "An accident? Oh, I'm sure it was. Just like the lullaby you sing is an accident. Just like the way he moves his hands is an accident." He took a step closer, his towering frame forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He lowered his voice so only she could hear, his words dripping with venom. "And the mark on his shoulder. Tell me, Winona, is that an accident too?" The color drained from her face. Her eyes widened in genuine shock and then in dawning horror. Her hand instinctively went to Ahote's shoulder, covering the spot where his torn shirt revealed the small, crescent-shaped birthmark. Her fortress of silence had been breached, her most fiercely guarded secret laid bare. I do not know what you mean," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Liar!" The word exploded from him, a raw wound of a sound. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. He ignored her gasp of pain, ignored the boy's frightened whimper. "You will stop lying to me. You will come to the house and you will tell me everything. You will tell me how a Lakota woman's son ends up with the mark of my bloodline on his skin." He dragged her toward the main house, his long strides forcing her to almost run to keep up. Ahote stumbled along behind, still clinging to his mother's dress, his small cries lost in the rising wind. The ranch hands watched in stunned silence, then quickly found reasons to be elsewhere. Elijah didn't stop until they were in the oppressive silence of his study. He shoved her into the room and slammed the heavy doors shut, plunging the space into shadow. He released her arm, leaving red marks on her skin. She stumbled back against his desk, breathing heavily, one hand still protectively on her son. He paced before her like a caged wolf, the 3 years of repressed grief, anger, and confusion finally unleashed. "Who are you?" he demanded, whirling to face her. "Did you know her? Were you there? Were you part of the attack? Is this some kind of sick game? Extortion? Did you think you could bring this child here and I wouldn't notice?" The accusations rained down on her, each one a stone, each one a blow to her honor. Winona straightened up, her fear transmuting into a deep, sorrowful anger. She had endured his coldness. She had endured the housekeeper's scorn. She had lived in the shadows of his house, all to honor a sacred promise. To be called a liar, a thief, an accomplice to murder, it was more than she could bear. "No," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "I am not a liar, and I am not a thief." "Then explain the mark," he roared, slamming his fist on the desk beside her. Ahote cried out in terror. "Explain how he has my family's mark." Tears finally welled in Winona's eyes, not of fear, but of profound grief. Grief for the woman she had tried to save, grief for the promise she had kept at such a great personal cost, and grief for the cruelty of the man standing before her. "The mark is his because he is yours," she said, the words falling into the silence of the room with the weight of destiny. "He has your blood. He is Margaret's son." Elijah froze. The world tilted on its axis and spun into a blur of disbelief and pain. "What did you say?" he whispered, his rage faltering, replaced by a terrifying, agonizing hope he had thought long dead. Winona reached into the neckline of her dress and pulled out a thin leather cord. Suspended from it was a small silver locket, tarnished with age and wear. It was heart-shaped, with the initials M and E engraved on the front. With trembling fingers she unfastened it and held it out to him on her open palm. "She gave me this," Winona said, her voice now a steady, somber cadence of truth. "For you. So you would believe." Elijah stared at the locket as if it were a venomous snake. He had given it to Margaret on their first anniversary. He had watched her fasten it around her neck, her fingers warm on his. He had thought it lost forever in the dust and blood of that roadside attack. He reached out with a hand that shook uncontrollably and took it. The cool metal was a solid, undeniable reality in his palm. He clicked it open. Inside were the 2 miniature portraits, his own stern face and Margaret's, smiling, her eyes full of light and love. The sight broke him. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat, a sound of agony 3 years in the making. He staggered back, collapsing into his leather armchair, the locket clutched in his white-knuckled fist. Winona watched him, her own tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She knelt on the floor, pulling Ahote into her lap, and began to speak, the story pouring out of her, a dam of silence finally breaking. "I was traveling to visit my cousins," she began softly. "I came upon the wreckage. The attack was over. Everyone was gone except her. She was hidden, thrown into a thicket of bushes. She was alive, but—" Winona's voice broke. She was hurt badly. She knew she was not long for this world. Elijah looked up, his face a mask of anguish hanging on her every word. She was with child, far along. The shock, the fall, it brought on the labor. There was nothing I could do. There was only me. I helped her. I held her hand. Winona looked down at Ahote, stroking his dark hair. He was born there, under a pine tree, as his mother was leaving this life. He was so small, so weak. I thought he would follow her. She looked back at Elijah, her eyes filled with the memory. She made me promise. Her last words were a promise. She knew her enemies, men her father had wronged, were likely the ones who attacked the coach. She feared they would come for her son if they knew he survived. She begged me to take him, to raise him as my own, to keep him safe and hidden. She told me to never tell anyone, unless I found a man I could trust with his life. A man named Elijah. Winona's gaze was unwavering. I named him Ahote, which means restless one, for he fought so hard to live. I have been his mother. I have protected him. I came here not to trick you, but because I had nowhere else to go. I heard of a widower rancher who needed help, and my spirit told me it was the place. I planned to work, to watch you, to see if you were the man she spoke of, a man worthy of her trust. I did not plan for you to discover the secret this way. The story settled in the room, filling every corner, every shadow with its devastating, beautiful, heartbreaking truth. Elijah stared at the small boy huddled in Winona's arms, his son, his and Margaret's child, born in tragedy, saved by a miracle, raised by the grace of a stranger. The rage was gone, washed away by a tidal wave of grief, regret, and a joy so fierce it was painful. He looked at Winona, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a servant but as a guardian angel, a woman of impossible honor who had sacrificed everything to keep a sacred vow to a dying woman. And he, in his blind arrogance and pain, had called her a liar. He had called her a thief. The shame was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. The silence that followed Winona's story was heavier than any that had filled the house before. It was a silence not of absence, but of profound, heart-altering truth. Elijah sat hunched in his chair, the silver locket a cold, heavy weight in his hand, a tangible link to a past he had misunderstood completely. He looked at the boy, his son, and saw for the first time not a stranger's child, but the ghost of Margaret's smile in the curve of his lips and the echo of his own father in the boy's solemn, intelligent eyes. He then looked at Winona. He saw the years of hardship etched around her eyes, the quiet suffering she had endured under his roof, the unyielding honor that had driven her to keep her promise even at the cost of her own well-being. She had been the sole guardian of his son's life, a lone warrior protecting his legacy, and he had treated her like dirt beneath his boot. The shame was a physical acid in his gut, burning away the cold, hard shell of his grief and exposing the raw, aching heart beneath. Slowly, as if his limbs were weighted with lead, Elijah got up from his chair. He didn't walk to her but fell to his knees on the Persian rug before her and the child. He, the master of Shadow Hill Ranch, knelt before the woman he had called a mere servant. He bowed his head, the silver threads in his dark hair catching the dim light. "Forgive me," he said, his voice a ragged whisper, broken by the weight of his remorse. "Winona, forgive me, for my blindness, my cruelty. For every cold word, for every suspicion. I was a man drowning in grief, and I tried to pull you under with me. What you have done, the sacrifice you have made, there are no words to honor it. Margaret, she would—" He choked, unable to finish, the thought of his wife's gratitude a fresh wave of pain. "She trusted you, and I failed you both." Winona looked down at the proud, broken man at her feet. In his abject humility, she saw not the cruel master who had dragged her into the room, but the grieving husband Margaret had loved, the father her son deserved. Her own anger dissolved, washed away by a compassion that was as deep and vast as the Montana plains. She reached out a hesitant hand and placed it on his bowed head. "There is nothing to forgive," she said softly. "You did not know. You were mourning. A heart full of sorrow has no room for trust." "I understand." At that moment the study doors opened without a knock. Frances stood there, her face a mask of pinched indignation. "Elijah, the foreman is asking about the stallion, and this disruption is unacceptable. If you will not discipline the help, Elijah rose to his full height, his face transformed. The grief was still there, but the bitterness was gone, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed authority. "Francis," he said, his voice calm but absolute, "pack your things. A wagon will take you to town within the hour. Your service to this family is no longer required." The housekeeper's jaw dropped. "What? After all these years? Because of her?" she spat, pointing a trembling finger at Winona. "You will not speak of her that way again in this house," Elijah stated, his voice like the crack of a glacier. "You have filled my home with prejudice and suspicion when it should have been filled with gratitude. Winona is not a servant. She is the guardian of my son. She is the most honorable person to ever set foot in this house. Now go." Stunned into silence by his unshakable command, Frances stared for a moment, then turned on her heel and marched out, her back rigid with outrage. With her departure, it felt as though the last shadow of the old bitter life had been swept from the room. A new fragile silence fell between them. Elijah turned back to Winona and his son. He knelt again, this time to be at eye level with the boy. Hohote, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide, confused eyes, shrank back against his mother. "Hello there," Elijah said gently, his voice softer than the boy had ever heard it. He held out his hand, palm up. I am your father." The boy looked from the strange man to his mother, seeking guidance. Winona gave a small, encouraging nod. Hesitantly, Ahote reached out a tiny hand and placed it in Elijah's large, calloused one. A current, potent and elemental, passed between them. It was the closing of a circle, the mending of a line broken by tragedy. Later that evening, after the boy was asleep in a small bed hastily moved into a warm room near Elijah's own, they sat in the main parlor. A fire crackled in the hearth, chasing away the chill and the shadows. For the first time they spoke not as master and servant, but as equals, bound by the child they both loved. "He needs his name," Elijah said, looking into the flames. "His heritage. I was thinking, Lorenzo. After my father. Lorenzo Elijah." He looked at her, his expression open and vulnerable. "But he is also Ahote. He is the boy you raised, the boy you saved. He should never lose that. He must know the story of his birth, of his mother Margaret's courage, and of his mother Winona's honor. He will be raised knowing both his worlds." Winona's heart swelled. He was not trying to erase her, to claim the boy and cast her aside. He was trying to build a bridge. "He is a child of two worlds," she agreed softly. "It will make him strong." The days that followed were a quiet revolution. The oppressive silence of the house was replaced by the sound of a child's tentative laughter. Elijah taught Lorenzo how to ride a pony, his large hands guiding the boy's small ones on the reins. Winona taught him the Lakota names for the stars that glittered in the vast night sky. They ate their meals together at the big dining table, the three of them, filling the empty spaces with shared glances and quiet conversation. The wall between Elijah and Winona crumbled piece by piece. It was replaced by shared responsibility, then by a deep and abiding respect, and finally, by something more. He saw in her not just strength, but a gentle wisdom. She saw in him not just a powerful rancher, but a man capable of profound tenderness. They found in each other a solace for their shared history of loss, a partner who understood the language of grief, but was willing to learn the language of hope. One evening, months later, they stood on the porch, watching the sunset, painting the mountains in hues of gold and rose. Lorenzo was asleep inside, safe and loved. The air was cool and smelled of pine. "I never thought I would feel peace in this house again," Elijah confessed, his voice low. "It was just a hollow place full of ghosts. You brought it back to life." Winona stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. "Sometimes a heart must be broken open," she said, her gaze on the horizon, "so that something new can grow." Elijah turned to her, and in the soft twilight he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled naturally around his. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound connection, of two solitary souls finding their way home. The bitter rancher who thought he had lost everything, and the silent woman who had carried his future in her arms, stood together, their hands clasped, their hearts healing. Under the vast and endless sky of Montana, they were no longer just a man, a woman, and a child. They were a family. True family is forged not by blood alone, but by honor, sacrifice, and a love powerful enough to heal the deepest wounds. It teaches us that we should never judge a person by their station or silence, for behind them may lie a story of immense courage and a truth that can change our world forever.